boldly engaging the mindless propaganda of our time, apparently with reason. This is Rage of the Age.
This is Rage of the Age, and we have with us a Martin and Illie Anderson Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, located at Stanford University in California. In fact, he has a PhD in the classics from Stanford. He is the author of hundreds of articles, book reviews, and newspaper articles on topics ranging from classical and military history to contemporary cultural issues. This includes a book called The Case for Trump, which had been released just last month. He is the recipient of the Eric Breindel Award for Excellence in Opinion Journalism, which he received in 2002. In 2007, he received the National Humanities Medal. In 2008, he had been awarded the Bradley Prize. He currently is a syndicated columnist for the Tribune Media Services and has a weekly column for the National Review online. He has an upcoming work of a book he's working on called The Dying Citizen. It is my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Victor Davis Hanson. Professor Hanson, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I have you here today because of an essay that you wrote called Dueling Populisms. And it's a very quick read, but a very profound read that you had written there for the Institute. And basically in that, you describe two views of populist movements beginning with the classical age. There is the egalitarian version and the liberty version that you were talking about. Can you basically explain these two different versions?
Yeah, I can. In modern parlance, we call one the progressive movement, and that is a constant drive to have an equality of result. And I'll give you an example. So if you have a constitution and it's set up to follow the Roman rather than the Greek example, it's a constitutional republic. It's not necessarily egalitarian. So egalitarian progressive or populist would say, you know what? Let's have the senators not appointed as in the Constitution, but elected. And then the next point is, but it's not fair even if they're elected. Wyoming gets 250,000 people get one senator, but we in California have 20 million and only get one. So let's make all the senators voted at large, which they are. The Electoral College doesn't reflect the popular vote, or let's get more Supreme Court justices. So it's a constant effort to reform or modify a system so it's always more equal, but not by opportunity, by result. And the other movement is a populist, conservative, more conservative, and it has a different view of human nature. It's not so optimistic, and it says, you know, people are capable of some very scary things if they're let loose. So let's have constitutional liberties in place to protect people from the tyrannies of majority or from government. And as far as equality goes, let's let people do what they want, make as much money as they want, do whatever they want, and then let's inculcate a private morality, religious, humanitarian, whatever avenue you go down, to redistribute or help people in need without the government taking something from somebody and giving it to another. So they're very different, although they both claim to speak for as many people as possible against elites.
And I guess that's what makes them a populist movement then, is it's against elites or aristocrats or bureaucrats who've been in power for some time. These are things that start from, I guess, the grassroots. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. I think the progressives say, you know, we don't want guys with cigars in closed rooms picking senators. And we don't want state electors overruling the rule of the people. And I guess populists would say we don't want permanent bureaucracies to infringe on our Second Amendment rights, our First Amendment rights, or we don't trust universities with free speech. So they both have a sense that they speak for average people more than they do elites, although at times I think the modern progressive movement tends to be more confident in elite wisdom and credentialed class than is the populist movement. At least
Right.
that's the current manifestation. If you ask a progressive, does Anthony Fauci instill confidence in you? He would say he does, because he's been the head of the uh, NIH, infectious diseases, the CDC branch of allergy and all that, and he's got this PhD and he's got all these sterling credentials. If you ask a populist, they'd say, you know what, I don't think he has any common sense. He's changed his position and he doesn't understand economics or that I have to make a living. So
Yes.
modern progressivism has a higher confidence in the credential class, I think.
I know when I first started reading Dueling Populism, the essay that you wrote, the first thing that popped in my head was the city state of Athens
Yes.
and the tension that they had between the oligarchs and the Democrats, and then even greater in that world where you had the Peloponnesian League forming against the Delian League, and they had that tension between their different paradigms. And then I was like, well, that applies to the whole Roman world as well, with the tension between the Optimates and the Populares, and
Yeah, I think.
there's like that constant tension that just keeps growing on these principles.
Yeah, I think it is, and that's what the founders were. They looked at those two models that are so well described on the Roman side by Livy and Tacitus and Cicero, and the Greek side by Thucydides and Aristophanes, Plato. And they said, you know what, we like the idea of direct voting to let people express their will, but we have to check it and check it between judicial, executive, and legislative. And we can't let the people just on Monday vote to kill Socrates, and then on Tuesday vote to kill the Melians, and on Wednesday decide they don't want to kill the Melians. So we have to have a legislative representational buffer. And I think the force of modern progressivism, whether we look at the Supreme Court or whatever it is, it's to remove any impediment to just 51% of the people doing whatever they want on any given day. At least if it conforms to a progressive agenda.
But these two particular versions, though you start off talking about the classical example, through your essay, you brought it through history, uh, speaking about, and you mentioned the differences between the American and the French revolutions, where it appears the American model tended to favor the rural liberty version, whereas the French adopted the more egalitarian version. Um, did these two different views of populism create different outcomes for each of those revolutions?
Yeah, they did. You can see that the founders had a lot of confidence in independent yeoman farmers, small farmers. That was about 90% of the population who they felt had combined hard muscular labor and then thinking on their own to survive. And that these were independent people and they could be entrusted with consensual government. And they erred on the side of liberty and property. And they said, you know what, if people are not equal, for a variety of reasons, some fair and some unfair, some rational, some irrational, but whatever the reason it is, it's not worth taking away somebody's liberty for the goal of forced egalitarianism. And therefore, and it won't work anyway, because when you destroy people's initiatives to be free and to prosper in their own given way, then you'll have a poor collective country. And the French said, you know, you can't trust people to be philanthropists, or you can't trust individuals to be nice to their help, or you can't. So we need to have a state, and we need to go after institutions that enshrine inequality. So they went out and started killing nuns and priests and aristocrats, and then each other in these cycles of, you know, there was the Bourbons, they got rid of them, and then they had the original constitutional Republicans, and they killed them. And then they had the Girondists, and they killed them. Then they had the Jacobins, they killed them. And then they had the Thermidors, and they ended up with Napoleon. So it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work, the founders would say later, it didn't work because they didn't put their trust in average independent property owning citizens of the middle class, and they didn't have a constitution that protected people from, you know, state overweening power. So they didn't have an enshrinement of free speech or due process or habeas corpus.
So the example of the French Revolution is quite interesting because they went the the outrage was against the abuses of the aristocracy and the king, and the lack of equality as they saw it in the egalitarian fashion. They started with the republic, and like you said, basically started killing each other off in the process and everything around them. And they ended up having an emperor again, but it was under the guise of we're still advocating the French Revolution. It
Yes.
almost makes no sense to me how it's like they reverted back to it. Do you think it's
Well,
because of the emphasis on forcing this idea of equality on people, whether they see it that way or not?
yeah, I think so. I think that's a tendency of the universal left, past and present, that they feel that their agenda is so noble, equality, that any means necessary to achieve it is justified, at least post facto. And it has another bad tendency, and that is, as you know, from the Jacobins, they were all aristocrats, Robespierre and his brother and the rest of them, Danton. And they believe that, or people who gravitate to the head of the left tend to have the money or the power or the influence to shield themselves from the consequences of their own ideology. So,
Oh wow,
what
that's
I
an
mean by
interesting
that
point.
is, yeah, so you know that Bill Gates is not going to put his kids in an inner city school in Seattle, even though he's
Right.
very suspicious of charter schools, and he's for unions and everything. You know that Barack Obama believes in climate change, and the seashores are going to be swamped, but he's going to buy a big place in Martha's Vineyard right on the coast.
Right.
And Hillary Clinton has railed against the power of money, but it doesn't apply to her because she charged about $10,000 a minute when she was running for office to Wall Street audiences for her little 20-minute lectures. And
Wow.
the left always has this problem where it gets hijacked by socialists, quote unquote, like Bernie Sanders that have 3 cars, or like Elizabeth Warren, who made a lot of money and wrote a book about flipping houses, or using her identity for extra little nudge for affirmative action, or Hillary Clinton, who left office in 2000 flat broke, and she and her husband are worth $100 million. So that's the
Right.
problem with it.
In your essay, you mentioned that the classical version of the egalitarian populist movement was often filled by what was called by the commentaries of their day called them like the mob. This was like the bad version of
Yeah.
populism. And of course, the Roman people come to my mind with the accusations of they just wanted breads and circuses, demanding new conquests to fund taking care of everything. Um, but when I look at like these versions today, it's not necessarily, I would say, the whole mob is involved like we would understand the classical sense, because you got like like a great number of the middle class involved with this now. You have a lot of, like you said, wealthy people are
Mhm.
kind of tied into this mentality. Are they just not understanding the cause and who it's supposed to represent, or has the egalitarianism changed in nature different from the classical version?
Well, those terms, mob, in the case of Athens, it's a late 5th century term called ochlocracy, and it means that the middle class was disappearing.
Uh,
And in the case of Rome, our word vulgar today comes from Latin vulgus, and it was a word for the mob. When the Republic of Italian yeomen faded out in the 2nd and 1st century BC, and it transitioned to a globalized empire of rich and poor. And so when people use those terms, they were describing a society in which a lot of very wealthy people, but not a lot of them, but not a lot proportionally, ran the show. And the people were mostly poor beneath. And then there were fights between tribunes and, conservatives, or sort of our version of very, very wealthy people on the left fighting very wealthy people on the right to see who can, outpromise more largesse to the poor. And that's whenever you get a society in that stage, it's a sign that the middle class has lost its clout. So if you come to a place like California, we've lost 5 million people have left the state in 30 years. And if you look at the per capita income of zip codes, we don't have a large middle class. We have the highest number of welfare recipients in the United States. One out of every three lives in the state. 22% of the people live below the poverty line. And yet, if you look at billionaires, they're all pretty left-wing, and they live along the coastal corridor from La Jolla to Berkeley. And they pay $1,000 a square foot per house, and yet they're very left-wing.
Right.
And they're left-wing, again, getting back to the earlier statement, because they don't think the consequences of their ideology of unionized schools, no charter schools, wealth tax, high taxes, open borders, new Green Deal is going to really affect them all that much. And it doesn't. And it affects people in the middle class. And the middle class has decided that if they're going to pay the highest gasoline taxes, highest income taxes, the highest among the highest property taxes and sales taxes, and they're going to get schools and roads that are rated in the bottom 10%, they're going to leave. And they left. So California is really a medieval society of two classes.
Wow. So is it because do these wealthy leftists who won't be affected by their own policies, do they view these policies as like some sort of a placation of the people who, since there's no middle class, it's just the poor and them?
I think they do it.
Is it like they're placating them like they used to do in the city of Rome?
Circuses. Yeah. Well, we have instruction from classical Latin literature about what the motivations in biographers like Plutarch or Suetonius or Juvenal wrote in his satires, turn the word panem and circenses, bread and circuses. But the classical definition is that people who want power appeal to the majority of people, and they do it by entitlements. And then there's also an element that people chronicle from the past, even in the pre-Freudian eras, that, and it really is apparent in the medieval period, and it's tied up with the concept of penance, purchase penance or exemption, and our atonement. And it works something like, I feel very guilty as a very wealthy person, but I don't want to give up my privilege and wealth. So in the concrete, so in the abstract, I'm going to forge an identity of caring and redistribution and socialism. And that's pretty much what the Hollywood elite that live in Malibu or the Hollywood Hills or Beverly Hills have crafted. They're mostly very hard left. They say they're socialist, but they say that in the abstract. They don't. When they were protesting about border conditions, some of these people lived in 20,000 square foot homes. They could have said very easily, come and stay with us. Or the university campuses were hotbeds of protest, and they were empty during the summer. And college administrators could have said, well, why don't we bring up all these poor kids that are in quote unquote cages and let them stay in the Stanford dorms for the summer? But we never see things like that, because for some, it's a psychological mechanism for squaring the circle of their own privilege and wealth.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you did, I want to encourage you to recommend this to others on your social media. You can do that by going to Twitter, write a recommendation, and then hashtag it with Rage of the Age Now, which is the handle of the podcast on Twitter. Hashtag Rage of the Age Now. You can also go to Facebook, find our page, which is called Rage of the Age. As it comes up, click the reviews. You can go into the review section, click yes to recommend, write in your review of the show, and post it there to the page. This is going to be important for the next few weeks, because each week I am going to give away a copy of my book called Not in the Wind, Earthquake, or Fire. And this book is a first-hand account of my second deployment to Iraq from the perspective of a combat infantryman, and it is full of many spiritual insights. And I want to give a copy of this book away. I'm going to give away one a week for the next 10 weeks. And the way that's going to be done is if you leave a review and recommend Rage of the Age on Twitter or Facebook, that week I will select someone who gives that recommendation, and I will send them a copy of Not in the Wind, Earthquake or Fire for free to someone who recommends Rage of the Age.
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
It also seems to be that it's like with the ideas of like charity or doing something for others, as you mentioned. It seems the left has this view of somebody else would take care of it, usually a benevolent government.
Yeah.
Not necessarily they will themselves. It's always somebody else's problem to deal with.
So if you believe in, and why do people on the left tend to believe that when we get old, the government has an opportunity, or I should say an obligation, to care for you in a nursing home? Or why do they promote daycare centers? And why not multi-generational families? Or why don't they say, well, everybody has a job. Somebody changed your diapers when you were 2, so you better change your grandparents' diapers when they're 92. Mm-hmm. Where that personal responsibility, why is it lacking? I think a lot of it has to do with a couple of things. One is getting back to the constitutional distrust of the state. If you don't distrust the state and you feel that it's the answer, then you're going to seek answers in it. And the second has something to do with, I think it has something to do with religion and transcendence. If you believe that you're going to be judged in the material world on what you did, your soul is imperishable, then you're responsible for your own behavior. And we expect people who believe that they have a soul, an eternal soul, and will be judged in the hereafter, then that's an incentive to do certain things. And if you don't believe that, you believe all there is now is here and now, and men and women are the only thing there is. It's responsible for them. And you believe in human nature, then you're always trying to say, there is nothing else beyond here. It's only what we do here. And if somebody's poor and dies poor, that's horrible. Whereas the other person says, well, if somebody dies poor, that's bad. But if they were noble and good people, they're going to be rewarded. And it's harder for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle. If all there is the material world from age 0 to 78, then you better make sure you can make it perfect. But if you believe there's something else, then you try your best to make it perfect. But when you don't succeed, you get philosophical about it. And you realize that it's the attempt or the morality within an individual that matters, because life is eternal.
Do you think there's an element of, since so many on the left I'll just say the left tends to have those who are not religious gravitate towards the left in greater numbers.
Yeah.
Do they tend, do you think, to
I think so.
make that their new religion, to feel that gulf?
I think Jung and Freud had pointed that out, and Nietzsche said that if you don't have a God, you'll have to invent one. Right. And I think you can see that with the climate change, or even to a lesser extent with the Robert Mueller investigation. There are certain causes that the left becomes almost religious about, and they're faith-based. So if you tell somebody, here's the data on polar bears, and they haven't disappeared from the Kodiak Islands or something. I'm just I'm just being very general. They don't care, because their religion is that global warming is destroying the planet and capitalism was behind it and fossil fuels, and we've got to do this, and or we're all going to die in 10 years, as AOC says. And that's not an empirical paradigm. It's faith-based. Everybody has to have a faith where they don't require evidence. They require faith. So we don't know where we're going to go when we're dead empirically. But people who have a religion believe in faith. I mean, I would like to say that we have all these miracles every day, and we do have miracles. But if somebody says, I'm a religious figure, and somebody says, well, turn wine into water, and I'll believe you. That doesn't happen. But it requires faith. The same thing about global warming or universal peace
Right.
or perfect equality. These become religious experiences for people
I got you.
because they don't have a religion.
To bring this into the modern age more so, you mentioned in your essay the dueling populisms. There that there's a populist pushback against both political parties in our day, especially regarding legal immigration and globalism. Can you explain why you think this led to Trump's election in 2016? Because I think that's what you were hinting to.
Yeah. Well, both Trump and Bernie Sanders saw there was widespread anger in the country. And it had something to do with globalization and geography, that people on the two coasts, the East and West, that had markets of 7 billion rather than 300 billion. And these are people in high finance, high tech, communications, entertainment. Suddenly they were not selling records to 300
Mm,
million to 7 billion. And they were selling iPhones and insurance and equities. And they became rich beyond any possible imagination just 20 years ago. But part of their success was built on outsourcing, offshoring, production, assembly, manufacturing. So if you had muscles and that labor could be replicated anywhere in the world at a cheaper rate, it was.
mhm,
And the Republican Party said this is going to make us all wealthier, because even though you may lose a job, you'll be forced to learn coding, or you'll go to Walmart and there'll be stuff you can afford cheaply from China.
mhm,
And the left sort of said, well, we're going to get all this money and grow government. And even if you got kind of screwed over in Youngstown, Ohio, we have a program for you and we
mhm,
have entitlements for you. So there was an anger in the center of the country and among a lot of the middle class that their wages had been frozen. And the left's answer was socialism and more programs.
right.
And the Republicans' answer was, let's get even freer trade. No, and we don't care whether it's fair or not. Let's get freer, and let's just let the borders be open. We'll get cheap labor
Mm,
come in, and when
right.
the cost of labor go down, then people won't come in anymore. It's not that great a deal. And if creative destruction means you can't produce steel in Flint, Michigan, then you better produce, transistors, or you better be coders or something. Go to the fracking field, but
Right.
let the market adjudicate.
Mm,
And Trump comes along as a nominal Republican. He looks at this field. He's got an animal cunning, and he does believe in his agenda. And he says, you know what? The Republican Party lost the last two elections under McCain and Romney. They haven't
mhm,
won 51% of the vote since they beat Dukakis in '88. They lost 5 out of the 6 last popular votes. And yet they did really well in the county and state. They run the legislatures, their governorships, they're doing well. But the top of the ticket's got this screwed up message of fighting over in Afghanistan or Libya or
mhm,
Syria for what? Or investing your sovereignty in the Paris Climate Accord or the Iran. What is it's just not helping people. So he comes
mhm,
along and he says, I'm going to drive wages up by limiting the number of cheap laborers that can be imported, especially illegal immigration. And then he said,
mhm,
I'm going to jawbone China and make sure that trade is reciprocal. And then a third was that besides immigration and China, he said the Middle West and the interior has not been hollowed out because of opiate crises or laziness. It was that these people got tax incentives to leave, and I'm going to make tax incentives to stay. And if you want to build cars in Mexico rather than Detroit, then we're going to tax them. And
mhm,
so this was, and then we're not going to fight wars for other people's agendas. We don't care whether it's democracy in Iraq or stability in Afghanistan. Those days are over. We don't have the resources to do it, and it never works out anyway. That was his message. And it was geared in a brilliant way to the Electoral College. He looked and said, I can't win the election, and neither can Marco Rubio, or either could John Kasich, or either could Scott Walker, because these states Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, North Carolina, Florida are where the decision is always made. Texas is red, Alabama is red, California, Oregon, Washington, they're all blue. But these states are mixed up, and we are losing them because 6 to 8 million people are not participating. They've just tuned out. And these are our natural constituencies. So if I can talk like a middle-class person, not talk down to people, and I can talk up America, and I can have a cultural, economic, conservative agenda that Republicans usually don't have, I can get these people to come out and vote. And because we lost them, we being Republicans, Trump said, we lost them by, hundreds of thousands of votes, 300,000 or 400,000, Wisconsin, Michigan, all of these, Pennsylvania. I can get enough to come out that we can squeak by with 50, 60, 70,000 vote plurality. And that's exactly what he did.
Wow.
And that's got him elected with a new agenda that was designed to appeal to about 11 or 12 states.
I know it's been a frustration for me as a conservative is the Democratic Party obviously isn't going to listen to their constituents. It's just top down. This is what you're going to believe and vote for. And their thing is you have to vote for us, otherwise the Republicans will win. But on the conservative side, there's a frustration because it's like we're not being heard by our party. So a lot of times either we won't show up and vote, or we cause trouble within the party itself to try to get people's attention. I think of the the Tea Party movement that came out once before to get the attention of the party, which seemed like it had an effect to a point, but then it's like they go right back to, whatever suits them with globalism, like you're saying, illegal immigration. But then there's like just the average conservative. We want our jobs back in our country. We want a responsible government, but not a huge, vast apparatus controlling everything. We don't want to finance our enemies and other nations anymore. We want to take care of our own nation. Trump wasn't my first choice, honestly, but when the smoke cleared, I was like, I think he's a man that can get the job done and maybe restore some basic principles of liberty within the nation. Um, so definitely, we're close to the end of our segment, Professor. So I want to ask you this final question.
Yeah.
When you wrote that essay, "Dueling Populism," for the Hoover Institution, what did you want to accomplish with the writing of that essay? What was like your end state you wanted to accomplish with people who read it?
Well, I wanted to do two things. One was to warn people among the elite, left and right, that there was a large number of people under the global paradigm who hadn't done very well. And on the left, they were left-wing students, 18 to 22, that went to college. The average student, half of the average students that go to college drop out. It takes 6 years to graduate. The jobs that they get with these degrees are not very good. Tuition increased faster than the rate of inflation every year. We have $1.5 trillion in aggregate student debt. So they were not getting married as like they used to. They were not having children. They were not buying cars. They were not buying houses. They were burdened with debt and dead-end jobs despite their education. And these people were looking for somebody, and that somebody was Bernie Sanders, promising them the government would do things for them. And then on the other side, half of the young people didn't go to college. And yet, when they went down to the plant or they went to where their parents worked in the die factory, it was gone. And when they wanted to go get a job, people said, well, you can flip hamburgers, which they were willing to do, or cut lawns or something, but that did not create enough income. And so those two constituencies had enormous cultural differences about on issues like affirmative action, identity politics, abortion, etc., guns, but they did have a common economic beef. And so we had a new socialist and I was trying to explain why Bernie Sanders, who's I think kind of unstable and a crank, why he was so successful, and why an outsider never had political office or military experience was nominated by the Republican Party. And he appealed to the other type of populism. They had things that were in agreement, but they had things that were quite different. We should remember that the counties in the United States that voted most heavily against Donald Trump were the most affluent counties by income. There was no doubt about it.
Wow.
Trump's opposition is primarily, not exclusively, very well-educated and highly compensated women, minorities, and white males. And
wow,
that vote and give money. And his greatest constituency are middle class, white males of the middle class and lower middle class, and perhaps some minorities of the lower middle class, but not the poor and not the very wealthy. And we'll see if and the two constituencies are about equal in numbers. And now we're going to have another election where the Democrats and their nominee will pile up huge majorities in states like Maryland, Massachusetts, but especially New York, Illinois, and California. And they're going to say, look at the popular vote. We've got 3 million people we won in California. We won by 1.5 million in New York. We won by 1 million in Illinois. And the conservatives are going to say, you have a slightly greater population, but if you look at the map geographically, you're two small strands on the east and west coast, a little bit around the Great Lakes, and that doesn't represent America. So that same fight or division is going to be replayed, I think, in 2020, and we're going to see Joe Biden, if he still is the nominee, and Trump spend about 90% of their time in about 10 states.
Wow. Okay. Professor Hanson, it's been a pleasure talking with you today. I appreciate your time and speaking with us.
Thank you. See you.
It is time for the question of the week. This is part of the episode where I bring up the question of the week from last week and bring up some of the replies that others have responded to, and also to ask for responses for the upcoming question of the week for this week. Last week's question of the week was this: how much control should the government have over the economy? And the one that stuck out to me the most was Michael Clark, who wrote, "Look at your paycheck, and that should answer your question." And Michael, I would just have to say that there are those who want far more control of the government and the economy. You haven't seen nothing yet of your funds being taken out of your paycheck. This week's question of the week is, which revolution do you believe was the better revolution? The American Revolution or the French Revolution? You will find that question on Facebook on our page, Rage of the Age, and you will find it on Twitter at Rage of the Age Now. In either of those locations, find that question, respond to that question, and I will choose one of those responses next week in regards to that question. Again, the question is, which revolution do you believe was the better revolution? The American Revolution or the French Revolution?
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
Welcome back to Rage of the Age for this week's essay segment. I hope you've enjoyed the interview that we had with Professor Hanson. And if you caught on to what we were talking about during the interview, there was a distinct difference in the way the revolutions of the French Revolution and the American Revolution played out in the directions that they went and the conclusions that came about from each revolution. Though the goal was liberty and freedom and such things as that, the results were absolutely different. I think the American version captured it far better than the French version. And I want to give some examples of that. First off, if you remember from our discussion, and I'll just throw this out there, and of course you can look into it more yourself. Always do your own homework, folks. Always do your own homework. The American Revolution was based heavily upon a liberty populism, as Professor Hanson would have mentioned, as a particular version. The emphasis was on liberty. The emphasis was on curtailing big government, and where each person has inalienable rights that are not to be taken away. And in the case of the American version, the idea is that God himself had given these rights and that no one should take those away. Now, when you look at the French Revolution and its example, it is quite different. From the very beginning, it was a secularized version of the American Revolution. In fact, many of the proponents and creators of the French Revolution had a hand in the American Revolution. Lafayette, perhaps you've heard of them. He fought with French forces here under Washington. He observed firsthand the unfolding of the American Revolution and its eventual victory. And of course, he learned many of those concepts while here in the colonies, which would become the United States. Also, Thomas Jefferson spent quite a bit of time in France, along with Thomas Paine as well, and they worked on these different aspects together and formed the concepts which would at least initiate the birth of the French Revolution as far as the intellectual input that was behind it in forming its main concepts. Now, I want to compare to you some of the differences, first off, in the results of the revolution. And again, you can look at this yourself, study it yourself. First off, the American Revolution eventually produced a sound government with checks and balances. We had to do a quick correction with the Articles of Confederation, realizing that we didn't have sufficient unity among the colonies to function together as one nation, and therefore to create a more perfect union, as the wording goes. The Constitution, as we now have and understand it, was created to help those states interact better than they did under the original Articles of Confederation, which was highly decentralized. That document today, the Constitution of the United States, is still our written Constitution. It is changed by amendments only, and that has been the case where amendments have been added through a due process designated by the Constitution itself, which allows for the altering of the document into keeping it in lines with changes through society, but also to ensure that better rights are taken care of and defended. That republic grew up well versed in the concepts of liberty and the rights of individuals. Americans were very well versed in ruling themselves. Many societies were formed. Many local social clubs were created, and they were governed by participation of the members, where they would elect presidents and vice presidents and secretaries and treasurers and have a sergeant at arms, and they were probably actually armed at that time. And they had a working concept of democracy, and they would work in these clubs and manage themselves by these different boards. They would form committees, and this was done in churches, social organizations, any type of societies, as they used to call them then, that would form. They would govern themselves by these democratic principles, and they would mobilize themselves, and it was fully participated in. And all of this was because of the concepts we had long inherited even before the Revolutionary War was fought here in America. The colonists were used to running themselves oftentimes because of the distance from the crown across the ocean, And the nation of Great Britain was only concerned about receiving its materials and goods and bringing the finished products back to us in that mercantile system. So they kind of just let us be as long as they got what they wanted, sort of thing. Well, we learned to rule ourselves because of that distance and because of the absence of the nobility being established on these shores specifically. But now I want to look at the example of the French Revolution in comparison to the American one. And again, Professor Hanson had brought up some good points. You can delve into it in more depth for yourself. Let's just say the American Revolution and the French Revolution were both successful at one point. Both of them had removed a monarch from ruling over them, and there was a attempt to replace those monarchies with a democracy and or a republic form of government. And there was this notion that with that government, that the citizens of these nations, both the American nation and the French nation, would have these certain set of rights that were particular, that couldn't be taken away by government. And so in that perspective, the American version and the French version look very similar. And of course, the reason is the French version was copying the American experience, trying to superimpose it onto the French nation. But it is after those lineups and considerations where they look the same, they, from that point on, go into opposite directions. They deviate from one another in their outcomes, in their views. The American experiment, as it was definitely viewed back then, the event that turned the world upside down, with Benjamin Franklin even saying, hey, you have a republic if you can keep it. So it was a new thing. They wanted to test and see how it was going to be. But here's the deal. The American version worked a whole lot better than the French one, mainly because the American people were first already determined to defend their rights and had already experienced what that felt like due to the distance of the crown. There was also a lack of violence that it was exercised in the revolution when you compare it to the scale that took place in the French version. And again, it is based upon these two different ideas of freedom and liberty, as we spoke of in the interview segment today. The French version is a egalitarian version overwhelmingly, whereas the American experiment, the American Revolution, was more concerned about liberty. And both of these were grassroots movements to overturn abusive, absolutist government that had just went beyond their reaches and had no intention of stopping or curtailing themselves. Therefore, the people did something about it. However, the French example is far different from the American, and I believe it's because of two main perspectives that the French Revolution had that the American Revolution did not. The French Revolution was extremely secular. It had, whether it didn't state it at first, it became anti-Christian, and it basically started its own little war against the church, and seized property of the church and attacked priests, guillotining many, putting them to death. And it was an open persecution on the Roman Church in France. Whereas in the United States, you did not have an outbreak of religious persecution because of a revolution. The idea that you would go to war against the church, that you would go to war against Christianity in the American mind just wasn't there. And it wasn't a goal. And even though there could have been, even though there were some in the colonies who did not subscribe to religion, were not practicers, you had some atheists, some who would call themselves deists, which they still believed in a God, there was still a respect for the church, even if they didn't want to play along with it. In France, you did not have that. There was open season on the church, and they went to war with it. So it was secular from the very beginning, and those ideas still carry forth today, whereas the American version, even though the idea was to have a separation of church and state, meaning the state could not have a state church like England had, and that's the true meaning of it, and it also where the government could not dictate religion to you and how your religion should be, because that's what the monarch in England used to do. Everyone was free to pursue their own religious faith. And it was expected as a right that you could do so. It was an inalienable right. Whereas in the French Revolution experience, religion was immediately viewed as an enemy by many in the revolution, and the result speaks for itself. The other difference between the two revolutions is in the American version, the focus was more so on liberty and for each person themselves to pursue their level of happiness with the benefits of the liberty that is provided. The French model is the egalitarian version, which was heavily vested in making people have rights, forcing other people to conform to things so that others can have these rights given to them and even maybe taken away in certain circumstances, which I'm going to point out here to you in a moment. And the French Revolution simply became bloody. Perhaps you've seen some of these on TV shows or in movies, or you've heard it in history class. But there's one contraption associated with the French Revolution, and there's a good reason for it. It's called the guillotine. That's where you have somebody's hands tied behind their back. They put their head on a block of wood, and another block's put on top to trap their head there. And then they pull the lever that holds the blade above their head. It drops with enough force to sever the head from the body. And it was used repeatedly over and over again. One enemy of the revolution simply replaced another. And here's the irony. Those who fought for the revolution died in the guillotine just as much as the aristocrats and the nobility and those who wanted to establish the old order again. They perished by the guillotine, but so did those who wanted a revolution. Each group, and again, Professor Hanson did a pretty good job of naming a good number of them. They would each turn on each other and start killing each other off, all in the name of the revolution. Why? Because of these different viewpoints of trying to make everyone equal by making literally everyone the same, versus what you can achieve just by being given the blessings of liberty by the American model. Now, I want to show you some differences. The American Constitution has always been viewed with this concept of mind. Those are our rights. You can't infringe upon them. There's no wording in the Bill of Rights as it's known, also the list of amendments as it's known as well. They're not stated conditionally. They're not stated you have the right to this unless. It's not stated that, well, if necessary, if the government can pull it off, then they're allowed to take this from you in these circumstances. That's not listed at all. They're simply stated, these are your rights, period. That's it. And they're not to be trifled with. Now, by comparison, I want to compare that type of thinking with a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which was written in 1789. This is the go-to reference for the concepts which were supposed to define the French Revolution. This is also a document which even today, especially among those who are secularists, love to refer to as almost like it's a sacred text, that this is where all rights come from, because this was written back then during the French Revolution, and we agree with it. I mean, ask them where those rights come from, and the answer in this very document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, is it comes from the law. Did you catch the difference? It comes from the law, not from God, but from the law. The Declaration of the Rights of Man was written with 17 articles stating basic principles upon which the French Revolution was supposed to turn on, and which was supposed to influence how government and society was going to operate in France. I want to point out to you the first article, which says that men are born free and equal in rights. Now that sounds good, right? That sounds very similar to American concept. But let me continue reading the rest of that article. Social distinction may only be found upon the general good. In the first article, you start to see the differences between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, between the concepts of a liberty populism, like the American version was, and an egalitarian populism, like the French model. The French model, the egalitarian model, the modern day left model is based upon the concept of the general good. It is based upon the concept of the greater good. Perhaps you've heard that term. Everything in the mind of the left and the egalitarian circles that main concept, the greater good. See, men are born free and equal in rights, but we can have social distinctions if it can be shown that it's for the greater good. So some will have more rights and freedom than others if it's better for the general good. Let's look at Article 4 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Article 4, this is the French document now. Liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. And then it explains that a little bit more. But that article ends stating, these limits can only be determined by law. There's liberty that you can enjoy. It's meant for everybody. And you can do anything you want with that liberty as long as it doesn't injure anyone else. Now, that's the first problem. The American version doesn't state, again, stipulations of, well, you have the right to free speech unless it causes trouble. You have the right to keep and bear arms, well, unless we don't want you to have them, sort of mentality. These limits can only be determined by law. This is a huge concept woven into the French idea of their revolution that the Americans did not have. That limits can be placed upon your liberty if it is determined by law. That the society can overrule its own liberties as if it's used to protect injury against other people. So that means you can have your liberties unless somebody subjectively thinks, well, that's an injury to someone else, and we can pass a law limiting your liberty. Why? It's for, again, the greater good, the general good. And it's determined not by Constitution, but by legal action of a government that decides, okay, your liberty is now revoked because we view it as a danger to someone or something, usually, the government itself. All right. I want to point out to you Article number 10 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Again, the French document. No one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, and they had to state this specifically, including his religious views. Sounds good so far, right? No one can be disquieted of their opinions, and especially their religious views. You're allowed to have those. But here's the but, okay? Provided, you hear that? Provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law. So again, those who have the power can set the law to protect the public order, the general good, the greater good, if they believe that your opinions, especially your religious opinions, are disturbing to the public order, then according to their own established mindset, the force of law can curtail even your opinions. Let's look at article number 11 of this document. Free communication of ideas and opinions is one of the most precious rights of man. Wow. If they just stopped there, that would have been great. But of course, in the typical doublespeak of most egalitarians, they continue on. Every citizen may, meaning you have permission, may accordingly speak, write, and print with freedom. But, see, there's always an exception. But shall be responsible for such abuses of this freedom as shall be defined by what? By law. There's this idea that you have freedoms, but we can take them away. If you listen to our first episode where I talked about free speech, but no right to be heard, where I spoke with Dr. Rebecca Cuevas, who lived in Canada for 13 years, she articulated it quite well to you have a right, you have rights in Canada, but you kind of don't. You have them unless the government revokes them, sort of idea. And it's the same idea that we see here with the French model. It is no wonder they took each other to the guillotine, because they were trying to gain rights and take them away at the very same time. And it was a repetitive process that continued on. And the irony is that in order to, quote unquote, protect the advances of the French Revolution and defend the French nation thereof, they ended up having an emperor, a king, emplaced in Napoleon, in order to bring order to society, to defend the French Revolution. They went right back to a monarch again. They went back to absolute authority. Why? Because in the egalitarian perspective, they see that liberty can only be guaranteed if there's someone powerful enough to make everyone else behave. Even to the point where they can take away others' rights in order to protect the greater good, the general good. That the force of law is superior than any rights that you may have at the time by the government. That is why there is such a tension in our nation today. For many of you, you're confused. You're thinking, I don't get it. Why is there such argument about politics? Why is there such a divide, a polarization they like to use? It's because you have these two paradigms at odds with each other, and they do not mix. They do not mix. You subscribe to one or the other. There's no way you have both, and you can't coexist with them together. That is why there is such a heated contest today between these two forces. And even now, we can see it. The egalitarians, aka the left, are heavy-handed in they believe in free speech, just not yours. And they have found ways to censor videos on YouTube and Facebook. They have fact checkers out now who are not even checking facts to discredit or eliminate or reduce exposure of any contrary idea. Any idea of liberty they oppose. But they're for the principles of liberty, you might say. They're for freedom. They're for equality and all these other things. Yeah. But the way they achieve it is by forcing everyone with a higher power to conform to set standards so that everybody's the same, and therefore they think that will magically bring in prosperity and liberty and freedom. Whereas the American model, which has always been and always should be, is based upon the principle of liberty. You have it, the government can't take it from you. No one should be able to take it from you. And that those rights are yours simply for existing. And we believe that others should have that right too. And that's the difference between us and the egalitarians. That's the difference between us who are conservative and those who are on the left. For those of you who are like wondering, this is one of the big tensions of why we seem at war with each other. One has no problem taking away rights to ensure rights. Whereas on the conservative side, we see these as inalienable. You shouldn't mess with them. You shouldn't be shutting down other people, just to give an advantage to another group of people. It's the wrong way to go about it. And I believe, as history demonstrates over and over again, when you try to force the egalitarian model, you have great outbursts of bloodshed. You have great violence taking place. And the irony is that violence will often consume those on the left themselves as they fight each other for power and determining who should have and who should have not.
You've been listening to Rage of the Age. If you loved today's podcast, make sure to leave a review on the media you're listening through. Secure future episodes by heading over to rageoftheage.com and clicking the RSS feed button. Until next time, this has been Rage of the Age.